The image persists in popular imagination. Native Americans living in perfect harmony with nature, their lives a romanticized tableau of simplicity and spiritual connection to the earth. Films and books paint scenes of dignified figures in fringed leather, dwelling in pristine teepees, their existence unmarred by the complications of European civilization. This vision, repeated countless times across centuries of storytelling, suggests a gentler, cleaner way of life, one where humanity and wilderness existed in balanced tranquility. The reality of daily hygiene practices among Native American peoples between 1500 and 1789, however, tells a vastly different story, one that would challenge the strongest constitutions of modern observers. The truth about cleanliness in Native American societies was far more complex, demanding, and physically intense than any romantic vision could capture. Across the diverse nations inhabiting North America, from the Haudenosaunee longhouses of the Northeast to the earthen lodges of the Mandan along the Missouri River, from the pueblos of the Southwest to the plank houses of the Pacific Northwest, hygiene practices were not gentle rituals of communion with nature. They were brutal necessities, shaped by climates that could swing 40 degrees in a single day, by the constant presence of smoke and fire, by dwelling structures that housed dozens of people in spaces modern families would find claustrophobic, and by a relationship with the natural world that was intimate to the point of being inescapable. Consider a typical Iroquois longhouse in what would become New York around 1650. The structure stretched perhaps 80 feet in length, 20 feet wide, constructed from elm bark over a wooden frame. Inside this single building, 6 to 10 families lived together, perhaps 60 people sharing the same air, the same smoke, the same close quarters through winters that could last 5 months. The longhouse had no windows. Smoke from multiple cooking fires filled the upper portions of the structure, creating a perpetual haze that residents learned to navigate from childhood. The fires never went completely out. Letting them die meant hours of work with friction or flint to restart them. This meant smoke, constantly, mixing with the smells of cooking venison, drying fish, stored corn, tanned hides, unwashed bodies pressed close together for warmth, and the earth floor that became mud with every thaw. The temperature inside during January could hover just above freezing despite the fires. In summer, the bark walls trapped heat and humidity, turning the structure into what one French Jesuit described in his Relations as almost unbearable. The people who lived in these conditions developed hygiene practices that reflected their environment. Bathing, in the European sense of sitting in heated water, was largely impossible for much of the year. Rivers and lakes froze solid from November through March across much of the continent. But native peoples had developed something Europeans initially failed to understand: the sweat lodge. These structures, found across numerous nations with variations in design, were not merely ceremonial spaces. They were fundamental to maintaining any semblance of cleanliness in conditions that would otherwise have been intolerable. A sweat lodge session involved heating stones until they glowed red, then dousing them with water in an enclosed space, creating temperatures that could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The human body's response was dramatic and immediate: intense sweating that opened every pore, followed by plunging into the nearest cold water source, regardless of season or temperature. Yet there were aspects of daily life that no amount of sweating could fully address. The smoke that filled every dwelling left its mark on everything and everyone. Clothing absorbed it. Skin absorbed it. Hair became infused with it. A person could scrub in cold rivers until their skin turned raw, and within hours of returning to the longhouse or earth lodge, the smoke would reclaim them. European observers noted this consistently in their writings, though they rarely understood the necessity. Without that smoke, food stores would rot, insects would multiply unchecked, and the cold would penetrate structures that offered only minimal insulation. The choice was not between smoke and fresh air. It was between smoke and survival. Children born into these environments developed tolerance levels that would seem superhuman to modern observers, spending their first years constantly exposed to irritants that would send contemporary parents into panic. The relationship with animals added another dimension entirely. Hunting peoples lived in intimate proximity to death and processing. A successful hunt meant immediate, intensive work: skinning, butchering, preserving meat, scraping hides, extracting bone marrow, rendering fat. This work happened in or immediately adjacent to living spaces. There was no separation between the slaughterhouse and the home. A woman might spend hours scraping the inner surface of a deer hide with a bone tool, removing every trace of flesh and membrane, while children played nearby and evening meals cooked over the fire. The smell was distinctive and pervasive. Fresh hides had their own scent. Those being treated with brain matter for tanning produced another. Finished leather stored in dwelling spaces contributed yet another layer to the olfactory environment. Modern visitors to historical recreations, even with the benefits of modern hygiene products and the ability to leave, often find the sensory experience overwhelming after mere minutes. Personal hygiene practices reflected these realities, but also revealed something Europeans struggled to comprehend: different standards entirely. Many native peoples greased their skin and hair with bear fat or other animal oils. To European observers, this seemed barbaric, a sign of uncleanliness. They failed to understand that in environments where temperatures could plummet and wind could strip moisture from exposed skin in minutes, these oils provided essential protection. They prevented frostbite, reduced chapping, offered some defense against biting insects in summer, and helped maintain skin integrity in conditions that would otherwise cause painful cracking and splitting. The practice meant that people glistened with animal fat, that their clothing became saturated with it, that bedding absorbed it. It also meant they smelled distinctly of whatever animal had provided the fat, bear being common, but also deer, raccoon, or fish oil in coastal regions. Hair care presented its own challenges and solutions. Long hair, worn by most men and women across numerous nations, required maintenance in conditions where modern shampoos and conditioners did not exist. Some peoples used soaproot or yucca plants, which produced a mild lather when crushed and mixed with water. Others relied on careful combing with bone or wooden implements to remove debris and parasites. The presence of lice was nearly universal, an accepted reality of life in close quarters with limited washing opportunities. Removing them was a daily task, often performed communally, with family members checking each other's hair in the dim light filtering through smoke. Children learned young to sit patiently while adults worked through their hair, crushing any discovered parasites. This was not considered shameful or unusual. It was simply necessary maintenance, like sharpening a knife or mending clothing. But the truth about Native American hygiene was as fundamental as it was challenging. These were not people living in blissful ignorance of cleanliness. They were people who had developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining health and functionality in environments that would test the limits of human adaptability. The sweat lodge ritual that seemed so spiritual to outside observers was, in practical terms, the closest thing to a shower that existed across most of native North America. But the experience bore no resemblance to modern bathing. Inside a structure barely large enough for several adults to crouch, stones heated in exterior fires were brought in and placed in a central pit. Water poured over them created instant steam so thick it became difficult to breathe. The temperature climbed rapidly, 100 degrees, 110, sometimes higher. Skin reddened, then began to pour sweat. Every pore opened. The body's response was total and involuntary. This was not a gentle cleansing. It was physiological shock deliberately induced. The duration varied by tradition and purpose, but sessions often lasted until participants could barely tolerate the heat. Then came the second shock, immediate immersion in cold water. In summer, this meant plunging into rivers or lakes. In winter, it meant breaking through ice to reach frigid water beneath, or rolling in snow. The temperature differential could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit within seconds. Hearts raced, blood vessels constricted violently, breathing became gasping and involuntary. This practice occurred regularly, for some peoples, daily when possible. Children were introduced young, their bodies learning to adapt to extremes that would hospitalize the unprepared. European observers recorded instances of native peoples breaking ice for their cold plunge while traders watched in amazement, unwilling to follow despite having not bathed in months. Yet the sweat lodge addressed only certain aspects of hygiene. It could not solve the fundamental problem of dwelling spaces shared by dozens of people with no modern ventilation, no separation of functions, no running water. In a man-in-earth lodge along the Missouri River around 1750, 40 people might occupy a circular structure 40 feet across. The floor was packed earth, covered partially with buffalo hides. Sleeping platforms lined the walls. In the center, a fire pit burned constantly, its smoke rising toward an opening in the roof when wind conditions allowed. When they didn't, smoke filled the lodge, hanging at eye level, making eyes water and throats burn. People learned to move in a crouch when smoke descended, staying below the worst of it. Sanitation in such close quarters required strict protocols. Waste disposal happened outside the dwelling, but in winter temperatures of 20 below zero, the walk to designated areas became an ordeal. Chamber pots or similar containers were sometimes used at night, then emptied at first light. The smell of urine was a constant presence in many winter dwellings, not from carelessness, but from the impossibility of complete removal in earthen floors and the practical limits of winter disposal. Some peoples used specific herbs or grasses to mask odors, replacing them regularly. Others relied on smoke itself to overwhelm other scents. The result was a layered olfactory environment that modern sensibilities would find overwhelming. Smoke, human waste, unwashed bodies, animal hides, cooking food, stored provisions, and whatever natural materials were being used for odor control, all mixing in enclosed spaces. Clothing hygiene presented challenges that Europeans, despite their own uncleanliness, found shocking. Most native peoples wore leather garments, deer, elk, or buffalo hide processed and softened. These items could not be washed like cloth. Water would ruin the careful treatment that made them supple. Instead, they were worn continuously, sometimes for months, accumulating sweat, smoke, cooking odors, and the smells of whatever work their wearers performed. When garments became too stiff or odorous, they might be replaced or treated again with animal fat to restore flexibility. The fat, of course, added its own scent and attracted its own problems. Personal grooming occupied significant time despite, or perhaps because of, the challenging conditions. Facial hair removal was common among many nations, achieved through plucking with shells or bone tweezers, a painful process that left skin irritated. Body hair received similar treatment. The reasoning combined aesthetics with practical concerns about parasites. Yet the very act of plucking created tiny wounds that, in smoke-filled, unwashed conditions, sometimes became infected. Medicine men and women treated these with plant poultices, but minor infections were accepted as normal. Scarring from repeated plucking and occasional infections marked many adults. The food preparation area in most dwellings existed in the same space where people slept, stored clothing, worked hides, and performed daily tasks. A deer carcass might hang from ceiling beams, dripping while people moved beneath it. Fish dried on racks near sleeping platforms. Corn stored in bark containers attracted mice and insects that then spread throughout the dwelling. The concept of separating food preparation from other activities simply didn't exist in structures where every square foot served multiple purposes. A hide being scraped in one corner, a meal cooking in the center, children playing nearby, someone treating an infected wound with herbal paste, others repairing tools. All happened simultaneously in the same enclosed, smoke-filled space. But perhaps the most challenging aspect was the accumulated reality. Each individual element, the smoke, the close quarters, the limited bathing, the animal processing, the communal living, might be tolerable alone. Combined, they created an environment that would overwhelm modern immune systems and sensory tolerances within days. Yet this was not occasional hardship. This was every day, every season, year after year. The brutality was not in dramatic moments, but in the relentless, grinding constancy of conditions that permitted no escape and demanded complete adaptation to survive. The treatment of wounds and illness in native communities revealed hygiene practices that straddled the line between effective and dangerous. When a hunter returned with a gash from a stone knife or an arrow wound from conflict, treatment began immediately. Medicine practitioners cleaned injuries with water, if available, or sometimes with urine, which contained compounds that could prevent infection. Poultices made from chewed plants were applied directly, the practitioner's saliva mixing with crushed leaves to create a paste pressed into open flesh. Modern medicine would recoil at introducing oral bacteria into wounds, Yet survival rates suggest these treatments worked more often than they failed. Dental hygiene existed in forms that would seem primitive but were remarkably effective. Many peoples used frayed twigs as brushes, chewing the ends of certain trees until fibers separated, then scrubbing teeth and gums. Some used abrasive materials, sand, crushed shells, or specific plant materials to remove buildup. Yet tooth loss remained common, accelerated by diets that included significant grit from stone-ground corn and the wear of using teeth as tools for softening leather or holding materials while working. By age 40, many adults had lost multiple teeth, affecting their ability to process food and contributing to nutritional deficiencies that compounded other health challenges. The handling of menstruation demonstrated the limits of privacy and hygiene in communal settings. Women during their cycles often moved to separate structures, menstrual lodges where they remained for the duration. This practice served multiple purposes: spiritual beliefs about the power of menstrual blood, practical concerns about attracting predators to main dwellings, and simple management of bleeding in spaces where dozens lived together. Inside these lodges, women used moss, soft animal hides, or specific plant materials as absorption. These materials were buried or burned after use. The isolation meant days spent in small structures with minimal heating, often in the company of other menstruating women, managing bleeding with materials that modern standards would consider inadequate, all while maintaining the work of preparing their own food and tending fires. Childbirth occurred in similarly challenging conditions. Labor happened in dwelling spaces or separate birth lodges, with experienced women assisting. The newborn was cleaned with available materials, soft hides, moss, or simply hands and available water. The umbilical cord was cut with whatever sharp tool was at hand, a flint blade, bone knife, or sharp stone, sterilization being a concept that wouldn't exist for centuries. The placenta and birth materials were disposed of according to specific cultural practices, often buried or placed in trees. Infant mortality was significant, with estimates suggesting that 1 in 3 children did not survive their first year, succumbing to infections, complications, or conditions that modern medicine treats routinely. The dead presented their own hygiene challenges. Most nations had specific burial or scaffold practices that removed bodies from living spaces quickly, but the process of preparing the deceased involved intimate contact. Family members washed the body, dressed it in finest garments, sometimes applied paint or oils. This happened in or near dwellings, often with the entire community present. The smell of death, even when handled promptly, lingered. In winter, when ground was frozen too hard for burial, some peoples used scaffold burials or temporary storage, meaning bodies remained nearby until spring allowed proper interment. The psychological impact of living in close proximity to deceased relatives, particularly on children, shaped attitudes toward mortality that differed fundamentally from modern perspectives. Parasite management was an ongoing battle that could never be fully won. Lice in hair and clothing were nearly universal. Fleas from dogs that lived in and around dwellings were constant companions. Intestinal parasites from incompletely cooked meat or contaminated water caused chronic digestive issues. Treatments existed, specific plants that killed or expelled parasites when consumed, but reinfection was inevitable in environments where dozens of people and multiple dogs shared close quarters, where food preparation involved bare hands and limited washing, where water sources could be contaminated by upstream communities. The acceptance of minor parasitic loads as normal meant that feeling completely healthy, by modern standards, was rare. The accumulated effect of these conditions manifested in ways both visible and internal. Skin conditions were common: rashes from smoke irritation, infections from minor wounds, reactions to plant materials used in treatment or daily life. Respiratory issues plagued those who spent decades breathing smoke in enclosed spaces. Joint problems developed early from the physical demands of constant work in harsh conditions. Yet these were not seen as abnormal. They were simply the cost of living, the expected degradation that came with age, the price of survival in an unforgiving environment that demanded everything the human body could give and often took more. When European colonists first encountered Native American hygiene practices, their reactions revealed more about their own assumptions than about the realities before them. French traders along the Great Lakes wrote of being shocked by the sweat lodge rituals, viewing the extreme heat followed by ice-cold immersion as dangerous barbarism. Yet these same Frenchmen might not have bathed in months, their clothing stiff with accumulated sweat and grime, their bodies hosting parasites they considered inevitable. The irony was lost on most observers. Native peoples, for their part, found European hygiene equally disturbing. The refusal to bathe regularly, the layers of unwashed clothing, the acceptance of body odor as natural. Each group viewed the other as fundamentally unclean, neither recognizing that both were simply adapted to different impossibilities. The sweat lodge practice, brutal as it appeared, actually represented sophisticated understanding of physiology. The extreme heat opened pores and induced sweating that cleaned skin more thoroughly than cold water washing ever could. The cold plunge afterward closed pores and stimulated circulation. Regular practitioners developed cardiovascular resilience that served them well in environments demanding constant physical exertion. Modern research has validated many benefits native peoples understood intuitively centuries ago. Yet the practice required tolerance for discomfort that most contemporary individuals lack, and access to water sources that permitted regular use. Luxuries not always available during harsh winters or droughts. Comparison with European settlements of the same era reveals that neither culture had solved the fundamental challenges of pre-industrial hygiene. In Boston or Philadelphia around 1700, chamber pots were emptied into streets, creating rivers of waste. Bathing was rare, often considered medically dangerous. Homes were smoke-filled from cooking fires, just as native dwellings were. Child mortality rates in colonial cities often exceeded those in native communities. The difference was not that one culture had achieved cleanliness while the other wallowed in filth. Both struggled against the same limitations of technology, knowledge, and resources. The methods differed, but the challenges were universal. What Native American hygiene practices ultimately reveal is adaptation carried to its limits. Every society throughout history has developed strategies for maintaining health and cleanliness within the constraints of their environment and technology. For native peoples across North America between 1500 and 1789, those constraints were severe. Winter temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Summer heat that turned enclosed dwellings into ovens. Limited water access for much of the year. No metals for large pots to heat bathing water. No running water. No soap as Europeans knew it. No separate rooms for different functions. Yet within these constraints, sophisticated practices emerged. The sweat lodge for deep cleaning, herbal treatments for parasites and infections, specific protocols for waste management, communal care that distributed hygiene labor across family groups. The brutality was not in the practices themselves, but in what they required of the human body and spirit. Tolerance for discomfort that would break most modern individuals. Acceptance of conditions, smoke, cold, parasites, pain, as simply the price of existence. Physical resilience built from childhood, bodies hardened to extremes that contemporary medicine would consider dangerous. Psychological adaptation to realities that would traumatize those raised with modern expectations of comfort and cleanliness. This was survival, not through conquest of environment, but through complete integration with its demands, no matter how harsh. The next time popular media presents romanticized images of Native American life, the clean teepees, the dignified figures in pristine leather, the harmonious existence with nature, remember the smoke-filled longhouses where dozens lived together through frozen winters. Remember the sweat lodge sessions that pushed bodies to the brink of heat exhaustion before plunging them into ice-broken rivers. Remember the daily battle against parasites that could never be fully won, the wounds treated with chewed plant paste, the childbirths in structures barely warmer than the winter air outside, the constant smell of smoke and unwashed bodies and animal processing that no amount of scrubbing could eliminate. Remember that survival required not gentle communion with nature, but brutal acceptance of its terms, day after relentless day, generation after generation. The harmony was real, but it was earned through adaptations that would test the absolute limits of human endurance.